the automated podcast.
Hi there, everyone. This is Marc Verbenkov with another automated podcast episode, and I really hope that everybody is staying safe and finding ways to cope as well as benefit from these lockdowns that many of us are facing. For me, it's actually been a lot easier to set up discussions with possible guests, and I'm excited to finally share the very first one with you. So today, Gilbert Kralinger will be joining the podcast. So Gilbert is a Barcelona-based freelancer, currently riding out the pandemic with his family in Austria. He's a content writer and digital marketer with a strong interest in technology, financial markets, and futurism. So I had the very good fortune of meeting Gilbert a number of years ago, and since then we've been regularly talking about exciting emerging technologies and what the possible social and economic ramifications might be. So we do discuss this during the first part of the conversation by exploring the current digitalization and automation transformations of work. But as we have all been stuck with this global crisis recently, we also talk about some of the more pernicious technological aspects that this crisis might bring about, which are important to be aware of today. So without any further ado, let's get into the discussion. So Gilbert, happy to have you as the first official guest on the podcast. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
So we've had many interesting conversations over the last few years about the transformations that technology is bringing about, and specifically how the future might possibly be shaped. And this is one of the main reasons that I was really happy to have you come onto the podcast and kind of jumpstart the series of interviews that I'll be having over the next couple of months. But I was thinking that maybe we could start with your work as a freelancer, which I think is even more relevant today as we're moving into a remote, online, kind of post-virus future.
Yes, sure. Well, to give a little bit of a background for people that don't know me or don't have any experience with freelancing, is I have a background in media. I started with film production, then later on journalism, worked as an editorial staff, and now do content marketing and writing. So mainly about technology with a focus on crypto, but I also write about pharma and supply chains. So freelancing is in some aspects different from being employed. I think a freelancer to some degree bets on himself to outperform the market average and outweigh with that the downsides of being self-employed. Because if you're self-employed, you have no holidays or no sick days, because when you can't work, you will not get paid, and you don't get any additional payments, monthly payments at the end of the year. But you gotta be your own boss. You can choose what you do, and including all the extras like accounting and marketing and so on.
Okay, so you've talked to me before off air that the freelancing space has kind of evolved over time. You said once that in roughly around 2005, a number of these platforms came out that enabled the ability to get clients digitally rather than just face-to-face. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think working as a freelancer has tremendously changed and developed. Let's say like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, everything was basically non-digital. You had just a national or regional competition, and all your knowledge was coming from either higher education, or if you had been lucky, from a mentor, someone that shows you the ropes. But nowadays, we had like this shift to digital economy, and suddenly you have the possibilities to meet up with communities, to learn, and to work in the internet, and the possibilities to use platforms. There are platforms much like marketplaces where people can be found or search for prospects or something like that. Very popular ones like I think like Fiverr or Upwork or Top Talent. And if you come from the more creative areas, then there is like things like the Dots or Behance, which is more like a mix of a portfolio and a marketplace. So yeah, big chances to find people. but also a responsibility to stand out, because these platforms are all built on recommendation and ratings and stuff like that. And if you search for, let's say, like some copywriter and you get 1,000 results, then yeah, it's really, you need to stand out from the crowd. Yeah, you need to be on the first page somehow and be seen.
Right. So this massive amount of competition sounds like it's also really beneficial for the employers or for the people that are looking for people in projects, and maybe not necessarily for everybody that are joining these kind of platforms.
Um, yeah, there is like, I think for people that work on these platforms, it's much like a Google search. Let's say you search for something and you get like the first or 2 pages results. You will have a look at them, but you would never skim the or look at the third page or the fourth page or 10th
Mm-hmm,
page.
mm-hmm.
So there's naturally people that get a good rate pushed on the first 2 pages will get also subsequent jobs. So it is, I think it's really hard to start out to get good ratings and to climb up the ladder. But once you're up there and once you're seen, you can make a tremendous amount of money, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's suddenly it's very interesting to talk about how work has changed from an employer's perspective, yeah, because also with the shift to digital economies and digital products, for example, I mean, like all those kind of like programmers and those startups that worked on apps, they were the first to show how it works to um, assemble a team on an international level and just use communication tools to work towards a common goal.
Yeah, I think it's radically transformed the way that not everybody, but certainly many people are able to work across the planet. I think that maybe you can touch on this a little bit as well. Due to this large amount of competition, there's a real need to kind of brand yourself, right? Like Nike or Coca-Cola has done a really good job of branding their organizations to be understood very quickly, what that brand is and what you're actually going to get when you buy something like that. But I see now that maybe this is the same situation for individuals and not just for these large corporations.
Yeah, that's certainly a very interesting observation. I think the first ones were the influencers that understood that you need to brand yourself and to position yourself to stand out.
Mm-hmm.
So that is like as a direct result of this high competition, because nowadays it's not only about to find someone that has the specific skill set, but you have the luxury to choose people that have the same taste like you, the same mindset like you, that fit into your team or your overall strategy. So I think the best way for people to get a piece of the pie is to brand themselves and to radically position themselves, um, because people will make emotional decision when they choose you. I think they make an emotional decision rather than a rational decision. Once they have a certain pool of prospects or workers you could choose from, then it's about the one that you have the most resonance to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I mean, this is really interesting, but I think it also shows just how drastically different work has kind of evolved over time. Right? I've talked on previous episodes about these like large scale transitions, from like hunter gatherers to agriculture to manufacturing, service, and now it seems there's this shift into the knowledge economy. And one of the things that I've also mentioned before is that at each of these large scale shifts, it's accompanied by automation of those previous sectors. Maybe I want to shift gears here a little bit now to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and this state that we find ourselves in. So I was thinking that maybe this crisis might be a catalyst that pushes us or moves us from the service-based economy into the knowledge-based one that you're touching on here. So maybe we can talk a little bit about COVID-19 and also how a post-virus future would look like. So maybe we can break this into like, what are your thoughts on life up until we find a vaccine?
Yeah, good question. But let's enter the realm of speculation here.
Of
I
course.
don't know it, but I have the feeling that we will have to find the middle ground between protecting the elderly and protecting the economy. So we will try to ease the measurements or open up shops again, let people outside and continue and progress to some form of normal. So we track this kind of new infections. As long as they are low enough, we can progress this way. And as soon as we see that there is new infection starting, we need to close down.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is possible. I fear this might take longer than people expect, because the traditional development of a vaccine takes, I think, 12 to 18 months. And especially if this is something that has to be distributed on a global level, they will make sure that this thing works. The worst that could happen is that a company announces a possible cure, you start distributing it to people, and then people die of the cure. So I think they will take it seriously and have a lot of clinical trials before it gets on the market. And then when we reach that point, still you have the distribution problem. Let's look now at this protective medical gear. That is a resource that is needed all over the world, and almost everybody is struggling to get it. I mean, I'm living here in Austria at the moment, and we are mandated to wear masks, but there are no masks available. So at supermarkets, they give you these cheap ones made out of paper and so on.
Yeah.
So, and if you think that let's say there's a mandatory vaccination going on worldwide, then you just don't have the production capacities to produce this in such huge quantities. So, okay, maybe this is another 6 months, but then we're talking about 12 to 24, like almost 1 to 2 years, until this is over.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is something that we've talked about before. I think it's also really important to realize that it could take this amount of time, but also that this is a period of, I mean, not just isolation and quarantine, but also radical change for different patterns in society. Like one of the things that everybody's experiencing, but also talking about, is that there's this radical shift to remote work. Right. So rather than thinking about flying to a meeting, you now have, Zoom calls or Skype calls. And this is something that I think is going to be continued within this, let's say, 1 to 2 year time frame, so that the patterns of people, the day-to-day way of interacting will be built into us. So, I mean, for my own work, I have to travel quite a bit for different meetings, and I'm just setting up Skype calls now. And I think that if this period lasts for a significant amount of time, then it will just become easier for myself and my clients to just always set up these calls as we go into the future, even when there is a vaccine. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As you said before, that this whole thing is a catalyst for technological development, because individuals and companies need to adapt radically now in this time if they want to survive. So I think maybe in the first month, people thought, okay, people will things will revert back to normal. But when this whole thing takes longer, then there is a need for radical adaptation if you want to survive. So we see now a shift into this new technologies, because you have no choice. You need to find a solution. So some proposals that would have taken months before now get approved very fast. And I think, people and companies, they will realize that it works, that you can reduce your workforce, that you don't need an office, that you can um, accomplish the same without flying across the globe. And I'm absolutely with you that once people change their behavioral patterns, for a longer time, like 12 or 18 months, then they will stick to it. So some things will definitely change and might never go back to normal or as we knew them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I actually read this morning that there's a CEO in downtown New York, and he was talking about this specific thing. And he has an office that I think he pays $10 million per year to just have and to use. And he's thinking already in 1 to 2 years from now, he's like, okay, well, I can just not have this office, but have a large maybe conference with all of the employees 2, 3, maybe 4 times a year, where everybody comes together, exchanges ideas. But because of all the digital tools that are now becoming better and more convenient, he could have his entire workforce work remotely, which I think is the way that we're going to be moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when we have like this thesis that the worker by itself gets more autonomous with his own networks, he's a specialist, needs to market and position himself, then this is also sure very interesting to think about how companies by themselves change. How will this whole thing change from an employer's perspective? I think
Mm-hmm.
at first, like the classical structure we have now, everybody's sitting together and in your cubicles, and then you have like some office from the boss with glass walls, so he can see all his workers, is something very outdated. And I think also I don't think that 9 to 5 is very effective, because you can just concentrate for 6 hours a day and
Mm-hmm.
really be really effective. Uh, and 8 hours is certainly too much. But the biggest shift or the biggest difference, I think, for employers is that you don't have this kind of oversight anymore. So you need to radically start to trust your workers. Or they would start to use more surveillance tools to see what you're doing at home. That is like the other possibility.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into the other thing that we wanted to talk about, which is what happens after the vaccine. So I think that if it's 12 to 24 months or so, in order to get us there, one of the things that many companies as well as state actors are doing across the world is implementing a lot of data tools, such as tracking your cell phone or using drones to spot people's faces with temperature measurements in there. What are your thoughts on having these things going forward and having them maybe continuing or staying around after the vaccine has been distributed?
So two biggest things that we can observe now will also stay, which is like the ongoing digitization and automatization, and stronger surveillance. So in order to defeat the virus, you need to track down new infected people and the transmission chains and disrupt them. So also one thing that I can imagine is that the virus is something very global, but the response is something very national. So we see countries that handle it well and countries that don't, are not so well equipped maybe to handle it, and others that are doing a good job. So the development and as the emergence of the virus and the development of the curve is different in every country. So compared to Europe, China is 2 months in the future, and the United States just started now. So what I can imagine is that we will never have a moment where the virus is everywhere under control. Maybe you have like now northern hemisphere, and then winter starts in southern hemisphere,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. So I think there will always be hotspots and areas that are generally more safe. So let's say you divide the areas, the hotspots, and the generally regarded safe areas into colors like red, yellow, and green. And green areas try to prevent new infections from happening. Then they need to be sure that they don't get people from red areas into the country. So what I can imagine is that when we return to some form of international lifestyle or globalization again,
Hmm.
with travel, that there needs to be mandatory health passports or something like that. So if you want to travel from green to green, then it's easy. Red to green, it's a no-go. It's just restricted. And orange areas maybe are something in the middle with where you have to stay 2 weeks in quarantine when you enter a country and 2 weeks after you left it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that we can already see, small signals of this. So my sister is in Berlin right now, and there's already been some articles, some discussion of having antibody passports. So once the testing is rolled out and people are able to be tested kind of at a national level, those people that have the antibodies to fight off reinfection would be able to go back to work and live a, quote unquote, normal lifestyle, whereas those who haven't had the virus and who don't have the antibodies wouldn't get that stamp on their passport, so they might have to continually self isolate or self quarantine as the economy of Germany, anyways, ramps back up. But I think it's really interesting that you're mentioning that this is also something that would happen from country to country, or from hotspot to hotspot.
Yeah, so I think it's reasonable to expect these surveillance tools and measurements to stay even after the crisis. I think a good example is 9/11, where in as a reaction to the terrorist attacks in the United States, there was a wide net of surveillance cast above all internet communication and cell phones and geodata and so on. And these things never went away
Mm-hmm.
afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. This is. I mean, there've been multiple protests and whistleblowers, and I mean, this is kind of been the era over the last 20 years or so about the state of national surveillance, especially in America. But it also has its ripple effects across Europe and other parts of the world. And I think because of that, we've had this growing discussion about the privacy of our own data, right? As these large corporations as well, like Amazon or Facebook specifically, continually gather more and more data about us. This fight to have that data maybe owned by us, or then selected and sold back to the organizations, might not go through as some people have been hoping for.
So I think this thing exerts pressure, and it is very natural that there will be some form of counter pressure. So I expect, for example, that privacy-preserving tools like encryptions and VPN and whatever will be on the rise in the future as people seek a way out of this to some degree. And I think it's very important because so often people, when people told me I have nothing to hide, I always told them it's very, very important to be wary of your data and your privacy, because especially now in this situation now with the virus, you can see that things can change pretty fast. Once your data is, once your data or the knowledge about you is saved somewhere, then it can be also used against you. And you never know what is now accepted and what might be forbidden in the future. So for example, like I'm interested in cryptocurrency, and now it's all fun and games because on a global level, it's not really relevant at the moment. But once it gains relevancy, then it might be something that is threatening the current financial system, and then it gets outlawed right off the bat. And then we will say like, okay, people that promoted this or people that wrote about this or whatever are therefore also deemed dangerous or worth putting on a list or whatever. So it's better be safe than sorry, and keep your privacy.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is definitely kind of one of the more darker roads that we can go down. I really hope that it doesn't turn out like that. I have seen kind of the flip side of things as well, where data is being used in, say, like the wearables that many people have, to now see whether they have a high temperature or not. So people don't need to go to the hospital; they can just know that the fever is coming, so they can self-isolate before that happens. But clearly, this is just a small example. I think what you've explained is certainly something that we need to be much more aware of. I can also put in the show notes there's a terrific article by Yuval Noah Harari. He's the author of the *Sapiens* books that I think many of the listeners have read before, and he touches on exactly what you're talking about. The continuation of a lot of the surveillance technologies that are being in place now, which I think both of us agree are very useful in stemming this pandemic. But I think the real problem is that once this pandemic is more or less solved, that a lot of these measures can continue and take away a lot of the freedoms and the liberties that many of us have grown very accustomed to over time.
Yeah, I'm all for using data, big data, or whatever to fight this virus, but then the things have to happen in a transparent way. For
Yep.
example, like if countries want to implement some form of tracking or some form of app, then make it open source. Let people see what the source code is, what is inside, how the data gets processed, and then it's a win-win for everybody. And on the upside, you have like a lot of unemployed developers that would be happy to improve this tool. So, but the proposals I heard up until now, they were more obscure. So I don't know where the data gets saved. Is it a server that is like in Austria and does the GDPR apply, or is it a server that is like on Amazon Web Service in the States? Who programmed the app? How is my data processed? What will happen afterwards? And there's many examples on when this went wrong. I remember everybody always say like, we take care of the data, and then 2 years later there's some scandal.
This is certainly a case that we do not want to continually move down. I see that the time is kind of running out here. So I think maybe, as we've talked about a number of things, a very brief summary here, and see if you agree, kind of what the main changes will bring about with the kind of post-virus future is digital work will continue, automation will take up a large part of where humans used to be working, and then these surveillance tools and technologies will be used for the foreseeable future. And I think maybe at a kind of a citizen or individual level, what we need to be aware of is that these powerful tools aren't used against us as time goes on, once the vaccine is out and once the kind of post-virus future settles in.
Yeah, totally agree.
Terrific. Well, Gilbert, thank you very much for coming on. Hopefully what we've talked about doesn't come true, and the post-virus future will be a little bit more positive, but maybe I'll have you back on the podcast to discuss some of these issues again at some point in the future, 12 to 24 months out.
Yes, sure. Would love to do it. I enjoyed it a lot.
Great. Final thing, where can people find you if they want to get in touch or contact you in any way?
I think the easiest would be on LinkedIn. You can just find me under my name in the show notes, but I'll spell it. It's Gilbert Kralinger, which is GILBERT KRALINGER.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gilbert, and hope you stay safe during this period with the coronavirus.
Thanks for inviting me, and yeah, have a great time.
So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.